All right, picture this. It's the 2000s. Your internet runs slower than your grandma crossing the street. Flip phones are the peak of technology, and every comedy movie feels like it was written by a bunch of guys who just discovered sarcasm. This was the era of absurd jokes, legendary one-liners, and movies that could never be made today without Twitter collectively losing its mind. From awkward teenage disasters to over-the-top buddy comedies, the 2000s gave us some of the most quotable, most ridiculous, and most downright hilarious films of all time. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into a decade of chaos, cringe, and comedy gold. Get ready for the best comedies of the 2000s. Alright, so let's go back to the early 2000s. Hollywood was obsessed with teen comedies. American Pie had just finished scarring an entire generation, Clueless was still influencing fashion, and every studio was desperately trying to cash in on the high school drama but make it funny trend. And then, in 2004, Mean Girls dropped. No one expected much. Another teen flick, another high school comedy. But what actually happened? This movie didn't just entertain people. It rewired the way an entire generation talked, dressed, and handled high school drama. Would you believe me if I told you Mean Girls was inspired by a parenting guide? Because, yeah. Tina Fey was browsing a bookstore and found Queen Bees and Wannabes, a self-help book that basically teaches moms how to survive their teenage daughter's social chaos. Instead of just reading it, she thought, what if we turn this into a high school war movie, but make it hilarious? The studio wasn't entirely sure about the idea, but they gave her a $17 million budget, which is nothing by Hollywood standards, and told her to go for it. The result? A movie that made $130 million worldwide and took on a second life so big that it's still making money today. Speaking of casting, we can say that this movie was a disaster behind the scenes. Lindsay Lohan originally auditioned for Regina George. Yeah, imagine that timeline. But the studio realized she was too likable, so they swapped her to play Katie instead. Rachel McAdams was 25 years old when she played Regina George. She was literally older than some of the teachers in the movie. But she nailed the high school tyrant energy so well, no one questioned it. Amanda Seyfried was almost Regina George. But the second she auditioned, everyone went, nope, that's Karen Smith right there. Tina Fey basically cast herself as Ms. Norbury because, well, if you write the script, why not give yourself a role? And somehow this weird mix of actors just worked. The plot tells us the story of a girl named Katie Heron, who has spent her whole life homeschooled in Africa, learning about the actual animal kingdom. But when she moves to an American high school, she realizes nothing is as vicious as teenage girls. Enter the plastics. Regina George, the queen of all mean girls, Gretchen Wieners, her insecure second-in-command, and Karen Smith, who has the IQ of a toaster but a heart of gold. At first, Katie is just trying to survive, but things spiral into a war of sabotage and manipulation. When Mean Girls hit theaters in April 2004, it was a solid hit. It made $24 million on opening weekend, which was decent but not mind-blowing. Then the real magic happened. DVDs. Once this thing hit home release, it exploded. TV reruns turned it into an event. Every single line became a meme before memes were even a thing. And suddenly, Mean Girls wasn't just a movie. It was a part of the cultural DNA. Today, the movie has made over $130 million worldwide and continues to rake in money from merch, streaming, and re-releases. So, can we say that Mean Girls isn't just a movie? Personally, I think so, because it's a time capsule, a cultural landmark, and a comedy so sharp Regina George would probably try to sue it. So yeah, grab your pink shirt, because on Wednesdays, we still wear pink. Now, let's talk about a movie that should have never worked. A comedy about a clueless, egotistical, mustache-wearing news anchor from the 1970s? A script so insane that the studio almost threw it in the trash. And yet somehow, Anchorman, the legend of Ron Burgundy didn't just work, it became a comedy legend. This is the story of how a ridiculous idea, a chaotic production, and a cast of absolute lunatics accidentally created one of the funniest films of the 2000s. So back in the early 2000s, Will Ferrell was on top of the world. He had just left SNL, Old School was a surprise hit, and Hollywood was finally ready to make him a leading man. That's when he and Adam McKay, yes, the same guy who later made The Big Short and Don't Look Up, pitched a completely unhinged idea to DreamWorks. The premise? A 70s news team, led by an egotistical idiot whose entire world collapses when a woman enters their testosterone-fueled newsroom. The first draft involved news anchors surviving a plane crash, fighting orangutans, and battling ninja stars. No joke, the studio almost burned the script on site. So Farrell and McKay rewrote everything, making it more grounded. Now let's figure out how this movie created the funniest people in Hollywood. Will Ferrell as Ron Burgundy. At this point, Ferrell was still just that funny guy from SNL. Paul Rudd as Brian Fantana. Back then, Rudd was mostly doing romantic comedies. Now, he's literally Ant-Man. Steve Carell as Brick Tamland. Before Anchorman, Carell was just a correspondent on The Daily Show. A year later, he was starring in The Office. David Kuchner as Champ Kind. You might not know his name, but you've definitely seen his face in 100 comedies. Christina Applegate as Veronica Corningstone. She had been a sitcom star, married, with children, but Anchorman proved she could go toe-to-toe with Hollywood's biggest idiots and steal scenes effortlessly. The year is 1974. News anchors are rock stars, local TV stations are basically frat houses, and no one takes journalism even remotely seriously. Ron Burgundy is the king of San Diego news. He's got the voice, the hair, and the confidence of a man who's never had a single original thought in his life. But then, everything changes. A woman, an actual journalist, enters the newsroom. Veronica Corningstone is smart, ambitious, and completely unimpressed by Ron's absurd levels of confidence and stupidity. Speaking of the budget, we can mention that DreamWorks gave Anchorman a $26 million budget, which was pretty low for a big comedy. But when the movie dropped in July 2004, it made $90 million worldwide, a solid success. Over the next few years, Anchorman turned into a cultural monster. DVD sales exploded. College students memorized every single line. Every comedy writer in Hollywood tried to copy its style. So how did Anchorman change comedy? Before Anchorman, most studio comedies followed a strict script. Improvisation? Rare. Weird, surreal jokes? Almost non-existent. About 30 to 40% of the dialogue was improvised. They filmed so many alternate jokes that they literally had enough footage to make an entire second movie. Wake Up, Ron Burgundy, which exists, by the way. The entire news anchor brawl scene? Yeah, that was a last-minute idea that turned into one of the most legendary comedy sequences ever filmed. And now, it's one of the most quoted movies in comedy history. So yeah, if you've never seen it, fix that immediately. There are movies that change cinema forever. Citizen Kane, The Godfather, Schindler's List, and then there's Superbad, a film that didn't just define a genre. It defined an entire generation of socially inept high schoolers who believed that the ultimate test of manhood was successfully buying alcohol. Because if you could pull that off, conquering adulthood was just a formality. Released in 2007, Superbad is one of those rare movies that Hollywood didn't try to sterilize into oblivion. Well, almost. The script, written by Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg when they were just 13, was originally even raunchier. Yeah, let that sink in. Two middle schoolers wrote one of the funniest, filthiest comedies of all time, while the rest of us were struggling to write a 5-paragraph essay on To Kill a Mockingbird. Naturally, it took years for Hollywood to take it seriously. Studios looked at the script and went, "This is hilarious, but there's no way we're making it." Luckily, Judd Apatow, comedy king and professional cultivator of awkward man-children, came in and said, "Actually, we are." Now, let's talk about casting. Originally, Seth Rogen wanted to play Seth because of course he did. But by the time the movie was getting made, he was closer to dad bod than high school bod, so they made him a cop instead. Enter Jonah Hill, who had the energy of a caffeine-fueled bulldozer and turned Seth into one of the most chaotically relatable teenagers ever put on screen. Then we have Michael Cera as Evan, essentially playing himself because, let's be real, Michael Cera has only ever played Michael Cera. And then there's Christopher Mintz-Plasse, the man, the myth, the McLovin, a real-life 17-year-old with zero acting experience who waltzed into his audition and annoyed Jonah Hill so much that they immediately cast him. Oh, and let's not forget Emma Stone, in what was basically her first major role. That's right, Hollywood looked at Superbad and thought, yeah, this feels like the perfect launchpad for an Oscar-winning actress. And somehow, they were right. But as with all great movies, the road to Superbad wasn't without its obstacles. The original script had 14-year-old characters, which Hollywood immediately flagged as way too illegal looking. So they aged them up to high school seniors because apparently buying alcohol at 14 is disturbing. But at 18, it's just comedy. Also, the cops, played by Rogen and Bill Hader, were originally supposed to be straight-up villains. But then someone had the genius idea of making them completely incompetent instead. And thus, two of the dumbest law enforcement officers in cinematic history were born. Now, let's talk numbers. The budget? $20 million. The box office? $170 million. The film was a massive hit, not just because it was funny, but because it felt real. Unlike most teen comedies, which are clearly written by 40-year-olds who haven't spoken to an actual teenager since the 90s, Superbad captured the awkwardness, the desperation, the sheer cringe of being a high school loser. Some movies win Oscars, others become cult classics, but Superbad, it gave us McLovin. And honestly, that's more important than any award. Hollywood loves war movies. They win Oscars, they make actors look serious, and they give directors an excuse to blow things up. But what happens when you take all that self-importance and throw it into a blender with a gallon of satire and an unhealthy amount of pyrotechnics? You get Tropic Thunder, a film that doesn't just parody war movies, it launches a full-scale assault on Hollywood itself. The film follows a group of clueless actors filming a Vietnam War epic who, through a series of idiotic decisions, end up in a real combat situation without realizing it. Simple enough. But what makes Tropic Thunder legendary isn't just the plot. It's how mercilessly it skewers every Hollywood stereotype in existence. You've got Ben Stiller as Tug Speedman, a washed-up action star desperately trying to prove he can act. We're looking at you, every action star who suddenly goes for an Oscar. Jack Black plays Jeff Portnoy, a drug-addicted comedian best known for making fart noises. And then there's Robert Downey Jr. as Kirk Lazarus, a 5-time Academy Award-winning method actor who goes full method by undergoing skin-darkening surgery to play a black soldier, a brutal satire of Hollywood's obsession with transformational roles. Somehow, Downey pulls it off, turning what should be an instant cancellation into one of the funniest and sharpest performances of his career. But wait, it gets better. Tom Cruise, in a surprise role, plays Les Grossman, a psychotic, balding, profanity-spewing studio executive who cares about nothing except money and power. Cruise went so deep into this role that people still think Grossman might be based on a real producer. Hint, he definitely is. Cruise himself insisted on the fat suit, the hairy arms, and the dance sequences, proving that when you let him go wild, he can be an absolute force of chaos. The movie wasn't easy to make. With a budget of $92 million, insane for a comedy, Stiller insisted on shooting in actual jungles with real explosions. Because, apparently, satirizing war movies wasn't enough, he had to film like it was an actual war movie. The script had been in development since the 90s, going through countless rewrites because every studio executive in town had an opinion. There were attempts to tone down Cruise's character, and at one point, there was panic over RDJ's role. Thankfully, Stiller ignored most of these concerns, and we got the glorious chaos we see today. When Tropic Thunder hit theaters in 2008, it made $195 million worldwide and became an instant cult classic. Critics loved it, audiences ate it up, and in the greatest moment of irony, Robert Downey Jr. got an Oscar nomination for a role mocking the very industry that gives Oscar nominations to over-the-top method performances. In the end, Tropic Thunder is a rare Hollywood satire that actually had the guts to go all the way. It's ruthless, offensive in all the right ways, and the last great R-rated comedy before Hollywood got too scared to take risks. If there's one film that perfectly encapsulates the phrase, "it seemed like a good idea at the time," it's The Hangover. What started as a simple bachelor party in Vegas premise quickly spiraled into absolute cinematic chaos. Directed by Todd Phillips, back when he made comedies instead of brooding Joker monologues, this movie took 3 seemingly responsible adults, added Zach Galifianakis, and turned them into living, breathing cautionary tales. With a $35 million budget, the film went on to make $467 million worldwide, proving that audiences love watching other people make horrendous life choices as long as they don't have to deal with the consequences. The casting is where things get really interesting. Bradley Cooper, pre-A Star is Born, but post-Wedding Crashers, plays Phil, the guy we all wish we could party with but no, would definitely get us arrested. Ed Helms is Stu, a walking stress ball with the worst decision-making skills in cinematic history. And then there's Zach Galifianakis as Alan, the human equivalent of a wild card wrapped in a restraining order. His performance was so uniquely weird that the entire script was adjusted just to fit his brand of awkward genius. Initially, Alan was supposed to be just a goofy sidekick, but once Galifianakis got involved, they rewrote the character into the lovable lunatic we know today. That decision alone elevated The Hangover from funny to absolute comedy gold. The plot? Simple. 4 guys go to Vegas for a bachelor party, wake up with no memory of the previous night, a tiger in their bathroom, and oh yeah, the groom is missing. What follows is a chaotic scavenger hunt through the worst, or best, night of their lives. The brilliance of The Hangover is that it's basically a detective story where the detectives are drunk idiots trying to piece together their own bad decisions. Each revelation is dumber than the last, and yet you can't look away. Now, let's talk about behind-the-scenes drama. Surprisingly, The Hangover didn't go through the usual Hollywood nightmare of endless rewrites and studio meddling. That being said, there were definitely some changes along the way. The original script had a slightly darker tone, because apparently what this movie needed was more chaos. But Todd Phillips pushed for a balance between absurdity and likability. There was also the whole Mike Tyson situation. The legendary boxer was cast after Phillips saw him in Vegas and convinced him to join, despite Tyson not knowing what the movie was about. Fun fact, he later admitted that he was high on coke during filming. You just can't make this stuff up. At the end of the day, The Hangover wasn't just a comedy. It was a cultural reset. It proved that an R-rated, unapologetically reckless film could dominate the box office. It also taught us that Vegas is a place where logic goes to die, and if your friend suggests a quiet night out, you should probably just stay home. If Step Brothers proves anything, it's that fully grown men acting like 12-year-olds is the comedic formula Hollywood never knew it needed. Directed by Adam McKay, produced by Judd Apatow, and starring Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly, this movie isn't just a comedy, it's a social experiment in weaponized stupidity. With a $65 million budget, it ended up grossing $128 million worldwide, meaning audiences worldwide paid good money to watch 2 adults scream at each other in their pajamas. Worth every cent. The plot is gloriously simple. 2 40-year-old losers who still live with their parents are forced to become stepbrothers, and instead of behaving like normal human beings, they declare all-out war over the pettiest things imaginable. Sharing a bedroom? Not happening. Who gets to use the drum set? A battle for the ages. But through sheer, unfiltered dumbassery, Brennan and Dale find something even more powerful than their hatred, a shared love for nonsense. And that's where the real fun begins. Now, let's talk about main actors. Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly had already proven their chemistry in Talladega Nights, but here, they took it to another level. Their dynamic was so unhinged that most of their dialogue was improvised, making every scene feel like 2 kids who just discovered how to say bad words. The movie also roped in Mary Steenburgen and Richard Jenkins as their long-suffering parents, who deliver some of the best "I can't believe I raised these morons" expressions ever captured on film. Adam Scott shows up as Brennan's ultra-successful sociopathic brother, aka the human embodiment of every LinkedIn influencer you've ever hated. Behind the scenes, the movie had a shocking amount of rewrites, because apparently even a movie about 2 idiots making bunk beds needed studio approval. Originally, the film was supposed to be even more ridiculous. Yes, that's possible. But the studio pushed for a slightly more grounded version. Of course, by grounded, we mean one that still includes a sleepwalking rampage, a job interview in tuxedos, and a musical number about boats and, well, you know. The real magic, though, is how Step Brothers became an instant cult classic. It didn't just rely on slapstick, it perfected the art of sustained awkwardness. Scenes go on way longer than they should, but instead of fizzling out, they get progressively funnier. It's a masterclass in committing to the bit, which is why, even 15 years later, people are still quoting it. So, what did Step Brothers teach us? That bunk beds are a terrible idea, that prestige worldwide is the future, and that sometimes the only thing stopping you from greatness is a lack of fancy sauce. Now let's go back to the second half of the 90s for a bit. Horror movies are stuck in an identity crisis. Scream made slasher flicks cool again, but now everyone and their grandma is trying to cash in on the trend. Audiences are drowning in copy-paste horror films where a bunch of teenagers make terrible life choices, trip over thin air, and get picked off one by one. And then, boom, enter Scary Movie, the film that takes all those cliches, cranks them up to 11, and then drop-kicks them into oblivion with a fart joke. Released in 2000 and directed by Keenan Ivory Wayans, this movie is basically what happens when you give a bunch of comedians full permission to torch an entire genre. It had a budget of $19 million, which in Hollywood money is like finding spare change in your couch cushions. But somehow, it went on to make a mind-blowing $278 million worldwide. That's not just a success, that's daylight robbery at the box office. But of course, no Hollywood story is complete without some good old behind-the-scenes drama. The script was originally even more unhinged. Yes, somehow that was possible, but the studio was like, whoa, guys, maybe let's not get banned in 37 countries. So, a few things got trimmed, but let's be honest, even the final cut is insanely over the top. And that's why we love it. The cast? A chaotic dream team. Anna Faris as Cindy Campbell, comedy gold. This was her breakout role, and she delivered every line with this perfect mix of naive innocence and I have no idea what's going on, but I'm here for it energy. Then there's Sean Wayans and Marlon Wayans, who just straight up ignore the script half the time and go full improv mode. And let's not forget Regina Hall, who turns what could have been a forgettable side character into the funniest person in the movie. You know you're doing something right when your exaggerated death scene is more iconic than half the horror movies you're parodying. Now the plot, if we can even call it that, is essentially Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer tossed into a blender with a gallon of Red Bull. A bunch of teens accidentally commit a crime, classic. But instead of facing consequences like normal people, they just pretend it didn't happen. Because that always works out well. Meanwhile, a masked killer starts picking them off, but instead of running, these idiots make every wrong decision humanly possible, on purpose. The entire movie is a self-aware train wreck in the best way, with jokes flying at you like dodgeballs in a middle school gym class. You're either laughing, cringing, or both at the same time. In the grand scheme of cinema, Scary Movie isn't just a parody, it's an execution. It took horror tropes, put them on trial, found them guilty of being ridiculous, and sentenced them to death by humiliation. It's dumb, it's crude, and it's 100% unapologetic. And that's exactly why it became a legend. If Burn After Reading were a person, it would be that guy at a party who claims he understands geopolitics, because he once read half an article on Reddit. This is a film where no one knows what they're doing. Everyone thinks they're a genius, and the only people who actually understand what's going on are so confused that they just give up and let the chaos unfold. And honestly, that's what makes it brilliant. Directed by the Coen brothers, this 2008 dark comedy is a pure, unfiltered satire on espionage thrillers, government bureaucracy, and just human stupidity in general. It starts with a very serious-looking CIA analyst, Osborne Cox, John Malkovich, getting fired. Not for being a bad agent, not for leaking secrets, no, just for being a spectacular alcoholic. In retaliation, he decides to write his memoirs, because nothing says revenge like a book no one asked for. Meanwhile, his wife, Tilda Swinton, is cheating on him with a guy played by George Clooney, who, plot twist, is also cheating on his wife. Because in this universe, monogamy is apparently a government conspiracy. Now, enter the real masterminds of this story. Brad Pitt as Chad, a gym bro with the mental capacity of a goldfish, and Frances McDormand as Linda, a woman so obsessed with plastic surgery that she literally tries to blackmail the CIA to pay for it. These two stumble upon what they think is top-secret government intel, spoiler, it's not, and decide to sell it to the Russians, because of course they do. What follows is an escalating series of catastrophes, where every decision is dumber than the last, yet somehow everyone remains absolutely convinced that they are playing 4D chess. Now, let's talk about the cast. Brad Pitt steals the show, playing a character so blissfully unaware of reality that you almost want to protect him from the world. Clooney, on the other hand, is in full paranoid meltdown mode, playing a guy who reacts to minor inconveniences like he's being hunted by the Illuminati. Malkovich is an explosion of profanity. Tilda Swinton is the human embodiment of an eye roll. And Frances McDormand is somehow both the dumbest and most determined person in the entire movie. And just when you think it can't get any better, J.K. Simmons shows up as a CIA boss who spends the entire film utterly baffled by what's happening, delivering deadpan one-liners that basically sum up the audience's reaction. Financially, Burn After Reading made $163 million worldwide on a $37 million budget, proving once again that the Coen brothers can make absolute nonsense look like high art. Critics loved it, though some audiences were confused, expecting a traditional spy thriller instead of, well, this. But that's the point. The entire movie is a parody of those overcomplicated espionage stories, except here, instead of elite agents, we have absolute morons playing dress-up with government secrets. At the end of the day, this isn't a movie about spies. It's a movie about people who think they're in a spy movie, but are actually just making a series of terrible life choices. And if that's not the perfect metaphor for human nature, I don't know what is. Let's get one thing straight. White Chicks is not a movie that asks for your approval. It is loud, ridiculous, borderline insane, and somehow, despite its sheer refusal to adhere to reality, it has carved out a permanent place in pop culture. You don't just watch White Chicks, you experience it, like an out-of-body fever dream where logic takes a back seat, and Terry Crews singing 1,000 Miles becomes an Oscar-worthy moment. So, what's the plot? Oh, it's simple. Two black FBI agents, Sean and Marlon Wayans, go undercover as rich white socialites to stop a kidnapping plot. And by undercover, I mean full prosthetic faces, blonde wigs, and outfits that would make Paris Hilton weep tears of joy. Apparently, in 2004, FBI resources could be used for an elaborate drag performance instead of, actual police work. But who needs logic when you have this level of commitment to absolute nonsense? Let's talk about the magic that makes this film tick, the transformation sequences. Because look, I'm no scientist, but I'm pretty sure no amount of makeup can turn two grown men into convincing white women. And yet, somehow, in the alternate reality this movie exists in, nobody, not one person, questions it. Not the elite socialites they infiltrate, not their new best friends, not even Terry Crews, who falls madly in love with one of them. This is the level of suspension of disbelief you have to accept here. And speaking of Terry Crews, this man steals the entire movie. He plays a wealthy, muscle-bound lunatic who is so infatuated with one of the disguised FBI agents that he delivers one of the greatest comedic performances of all time. The 1,000 Miles car scene, iconic. The dance battle, legendary. The I don't date black women moment, where he reveals his deeply flawed yet hysterical dating philosophy, cinematic perfection. Financially, White Chicks did shockingly well, pulling in $113 million worldwide on a $37 million budget. Critics hated it, audiences loved it, and it has since become one of the most quotable comedies of the early 2000s. You can thank the Wayans brothers for that. This film is their brainchild, and while it might be completely unhinged, it is also wildly entertaining. At its core, White Chicks is a bizarre but effective satire of early 2000s celebrity culture, Mean Girls-style social cliques, and the absolute absurdity of the rich and famous. But let's be real, no one is watching this movie for its deep social commentary. You're here for the dumb jokes, the over-the-top performances, and the fact that this movie refuses to take itself seriously for even a second. And honestly, that's what makes it great. And closing out this list, we have Meet the Parents, the movie that made every boyfriend in America break into a nervous sweat. Picture this, you're madly in love, ready to pop the question, and all that stands between you and eternal happiness is one weekend with your girlfriend's parents. Seems easy, right? Wrong, because in Meet the Parents, that parent is Robert De Niro, and he is not here to make your life easy. Our unlucky protagonist, is Greg Focker, Ben Stiller, a well-meaning but tragically awkward male nurse who just wants to impress his girlfriend's dad, Jack Burns. Small problem. Jack is a former CIA operative with a personality colder than an Alaskan winter. The man doesn't just dislike Greg, he subjects him to a psychological boot camp disguised as a friendly family weekend. Lie detectors, secret cameras, a circle of trust that Greg is absolutely not in. It's a full-blown interrogation with lawn games in between. This movie thrives on pure cringe comedy. It's a 2-hour slow-motion car crash where everything that can go wrong will go wrong, and Ben Stiller will suffer for our entertainment. Losing luggage? Check. Knocking over an urn? Double check. Setting the house on fire? You better believe it. It's one of those films where you watch through your fingers, internally screaming, "Greg, for the love of God, just stop talking." And let's talk about the real MVP. De Niro as Jack Burns is terrifyingly hilarious. He's not yelling. He's not throwing punches. He's just staring, analyzing, quietly destroying Greg's self-esteem with surgical precision. The man has CIA training. Greg doesn't stand a chance. And yet, the beauty of Meet the Parents is that, beneath all the humiliation, the movie taps into a very real fear. That meeting the in-laws is basically a survival test. Financially, Meet the Parents was an absolute beast. Made on a $55 million budget, it raked in a whopping $330 million worldwide, proving that audiences love watching Ben Stiller suffer. It was so successful that it spawned 2 sequels, though, let's be honest, nothing tops the original. So why does Meet the Parents still hold up? Simple. It speaks to universal pain. We've all been Greg at some point, desperately trying to impress someone who already decided they hate us. And sure, our failures didn't involve lie detectors and CIA surveillance, but the emotional scars? Oh, those are very real. And there you have it. Some of the best comedies the 2000s had to offer. A decade where awkwardness, absurdity, and absolute chaos reigned supreme. Whether it was over-the-top action, painfully relatable cringe, or just straight-up ridiculousness, these films defined an era of comedy we still quote today. So, which one's your favorite? Did we miss any classics? Let us know in the comments, unless your favorite is Norbit, in which case, we need to have a serious talk. Thanks for watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.